Okay, so we're going to move on to another big topic within programming, which is called repetition. Alrighty, here. So within programming, you can use an if statement to select whether to run a line of code or not, and we can use some looping mechanisms. So we call these loops to repeat a line of code if necessary. So I'm going to define the main function here. And again, I'm going to execute the main function on line 5. And then I need to then define what I want, what code I want inside my main function. So we're going to start looking at looping. And we'll start with the while loop. So I'll call this while loop. Now a loop, or the reason we call it a loop is because when you run your code, it kind of visually, that's what you're doing. You're looping back to a line of code. So let's start off by first creating here a problem statement. Like, what do we want to do? Well, why don't we ask our application here to just print the numbers 1 through 10. And you would say, okay, well, that's not bad. I can print the number 1 and then print 2, print 3, print 4, print 5. And you can take all this and then just copy it and then paste it, and then we can just 6, 7, 8, 9, and then finally 10. And so I'm not using the while loop yet, but I'm kind of giving you an idea of why using a while loop is convenient. So I'm going to run this. I'm going to save this under the repetition folder. I'm going to call this while loops. Notice I run it and it does indeed print the numbers 1 through 10, which is good. But then what if they ask you print the numbers 1 through 100 or 1 through 1,000? And you said, oh God, well, it took me 10 lines of code to print the numbers 1 through 10. It would take you 1,000 lines of code to print the numbers 1 through 1,000 if you did it this way. And so then we say, okay, well, this is repetitive. You're printing every time you're printing. The only small change here is that you're not printing the same number. But that's okay because there is a pattern here with this number. It's increasing by 1 every time. So you're incrementing that number by 1 every time. And that's where we get into using loops. So let me go ahead and show you how I would do the exact same task, which is just print the numbers 1 through 10 with a loop. Now for a while loop, let me just kind of get rid of this for now. For a while loop, you need to do 3 things. The first thing you need to do is initialize a variable that I'm going to call a counter variable. I'll just call it a counter. Initialize a counter, and we call it a counter because it's going to keep count, basically. That's why we call it a counter. Then we're going to do the implement the while loop, and have a Boolean expression to determine how many times, when you want to stop looping. And then within the while loop, we need to update the counter, which I'll write in a comment in a little bit. So I'm going to initialize a variable here, call it count. And I'm going to start it at 1. Now, I could call it any other name. It doesn't have to have the name count. You could call it anything, really. X, Y, just num, value, whatever you want. The reason I'm initializing it to 1 is because that's the first number I want to print, a 1. And then I'm going to use a while loop. So a while loop looks like that. Notice how the word while changes color. And then in parentheses, we need to write a Boolean expression, and then we need a colon. Okay, now what's in the parentheses is the expression that we write that tells the computer when we want to keep looping. And so we're going to say that we want to keep looping while count is less than or equal to 10. And I put 10 here because that's the last number that was printed. And what I'm going to do here is inside of the while loop, notice how, because I placed the colon there, when I pressed enter, it indented further, which is important in Python. Python is really picky here with indentation, and that's how it knows how to treat certain lines of code. So make sure that it indented for you. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to print count. So that's the only command in the while loop, but there is a third. I mentioned the while loop needs three things. Here's the third thing that we need to do in a while loop, and that's to update the counter variable. And so after I print count, I'm going to say that count is equal to count plus 1. Now, let me explain what this means right here, because it could be confusing. So let me make sure that you understand. Count is equal to what it used to equal plus 1. So I'll write here a comment that this means that we're adding 1 to count. That's what this is doing. If I put here 2 instead, count equals count plus 2, then I would be adding 2 to count every time. But I'll put a 1 here. If you don't have this line of code where we're updating the counter variable, in this case count, then you will engage in what we call an infinite loop. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. So let me talk a little bit about how this works. We say count is 1, and then while count is less than or equal to 10, what do we want to do? We want to print whatever count is, and then we want to increment count by 1 right here on line 16. And this is called a loop because once you execute line 16, you don't go to line 17. So let's say that I had here on line 18. This is not inside of the while loop, by the way. I'll put here looping done, meaning we're done looping. You don't go from line 16, you don't go to line 18. What you do is that after you're done here at line 16, you loop back to line 11 and you check the condition again. So is count less than or equal to 10? And if the answer is yes, then you once again execute line 13 and then execute line 16. And then you loop back to line 11 and check the condition again. Now, although count is 1 and 1 is less than 10, and when we print 1, that's going to show up here. But then we're going to say count is what it used to be, which is 1 plus 1. That's 2 now. And so count is 2, and you loop back to line 11, and you check again. Is 2 less than or equal to 10? The answer is yes. So print 2. Increase count by 1, so now count is 3. You loop back to line 11. So 3, is it less than 10? Yes. And you keep looping. That's why, again, we called this a loop, a while loop. Every time we loop, we call that an iteration of our loop. And you're going to get eventually to 10. 10, is it less than or equal to 10? The answer is yes. So we're going to print 10. And then we're going to increase count by 1. So count will be 11. And you loop back to line 11. And is 11 less than 10? Nope. Is it equal to 10? No. So you don't print anymore. You do not execute line 13. That's done. You do not increase count by 1. And then you proceed to line 18 where you print looping done. Notice how really this only takes 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of code. Whereas before I'd use 10 lines of code to print this. Now I'm only using 4. And if I run this, notice how it prints the exact same. The numbers 1 through 10. and then looping done at the very end. If I was to do a print statement after count equals count plus 1, so it was print and wrote something like looping in process, meaning we are in the process of looping through this code. Notice how it prints that every time after it prints whatever count is. So print count, increase count by 1, print looping in process, and it's printing. It prints 10 times, and then finally it prints looping done once at the very end, because if you don't want to print more than once, then you place that print statement outside of the loop. And I know that line 19 is outside of the loop because it is not indented. If I was to indent this, then that is now inside of the while loop, and it would print multiple times. That's not what I want. Excuse me. So now let's actually see how this is even more convenient. Say you want to print the numbers 1 through 500. All I have to do is make that change here. So while count is less than or equal to 500, print whatever count is and increase count by 1. And so where this would have taken us 500 lines of code, if I was to do a print statement like I did at the beginning of this video, now it still only takes us 4 lines of code, and it actually does indeed print all the numbers 1 through 500. There we are. So pretty good. Now, if you only want to print the even numbers, let's just suppose that you only want even numbers between 1 and 500. So all the even numbers are numbers that can be divided by 2. Well, I would start count at 2 instead. And instead of adding 1 to count, I would add 2 to count. Because then if I add 2 to 2, that's 4. And if I add 4 plus 2 is 6. 6 plus 2 is 8, so on and so forth. And let's just say I only want the even numbers from between 2 and 100. Again, notice how it prints only even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, all the way down to 100. And then it says looping done. Now let's see how we can get an infinite loop here and what that does. So let's say I do not include the this update the statement to update the counter, line 16. Let's say I comment that out. So I can just do that by putting the pound symbol there in the front. Notice what happens here. It prints 2s, and this is actually still running. Notice how it says that omitting some output. So we've kind of like broken our code here pretty much. When this happens, you can go to options and you can restart the shell. And that terminates your program. So always with the while loop, you need to first initialize the variable that's keeping count. You need a condition here that is true, but that will eventually be false by including this update statement. Now, you can't just, the looping here is not restricted to just printing. We can do other things. So let me start here again with count equals 1. Let's just go to 10. And that's only so that I don't see a lot of numbers here on the Python shell. I'm going to increase count by 1 like I was doing before. And you could do things with count, like you could say something like the times tables of 5. So I'm gonna print the multiples of 5. So I can make a variable here called mult, short for multiple of 5 equals count times 5. Now remember, count is 1. 1 times 5 is 5, but then count is going to be 2. So 2 times 5 is 10. 3 times 5 is 15. And then I'm going to print, the multiples of 5. Notice how it does 5, 10, 15, all the way up to 50. Because count, the last value of count that still meets this criteria is 10. 10 is still less than, well, not quite less than, but it's equal to 10. And so that's the last value of count that will let us come into the loop and execute this. Now you see a different way of printing the multiples of 5. Just like I had shown you a different way of printing all the even numbers, which happen to be multiples of 2. But the objective here is for you to understand that just printing count is not the end goal here. As a matter of fact, we do a lot more thing with while loops. But what I do want you to understand is how this loop works. It checks the condition. So count is 1. 1 is less than 10. So carry out line 13. Carry out line 14. Increment count by 1 on line 17. And this is, you're basically getting to the end of the loop. So loop back to line 11. And now count is 2. Is 2 less than 10? Yes. So go through the process again until you get to line 17, where count is 3. And then loop back to line 11. Is 3 less than 10? Yes. And you keep looping until this condition is no longer true. When this condition is no longer true, you exit the loop and go to the next line here, which is this print statement on line 19. So an introduction to looping with the while loop.